Okay, so now that we have our UVs unwrapped for this piece, we can bake our normal map. So this process is going to be pretty much the same as it was for our tile sets, but let's look at some of the things we need to know about for a piece such as this. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to smooth out my shading here. It's just going to help this achieve its overall look, because if we look at our reference here, this piece is pretty smoothed out, and here we have all of these like faceted areas. So to smooth our shading for this, I'm gonna, in object mode, just right click on the piece, and the first option here is just shade smooth. It's just gonna smooth out all those edges. Okay, so let's look at how to bake these normals. Currently, the material I have applied to this is my UV grid. I'm just going to delete this material from my piece by selecting it here in the Materials tab and just clicking this minus sign. And I want to create a new material for this to represent our final textures. So I'm just going to hit New. We can name it whatever we want. Let's name it M for material underscore Olmec. Sure. Okay, so let's look at how to bake normal maps for a piece like this. I'm just going to minimize this because I don't really need the reference anymore. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is come up to our Render Properties tab, and if we are still in the EV render engine, which is the default for Blender, we just want to change that to Cycles, which will give us, of course, our all of our bake settings down here. I'm going to change my device from CPU to GPU compute to speed up the baking process, and I'm also going to just double check that my Cycles render device is set to the proper settings here. Okay, so let's look at our bake settings here. Now, when we baked our normal map for our tiling texture, we had a plane that we had sculpted on, and then we had a smaller plane on top of it that was completely flat. So we can use the same theory there to bake our sculpted pieces. However, because we used a multi-res modifier, there's actually a much quicker way to bake our normal maps. So I'm going to come over into our shading tab here, and I'm just going to collapse this file browser because I don't need it, and I just want as much space up here as I can get. So in our shading tab, we have our material here for the material we just created, which is this M underscore Olmec. And of course we have no textures in it. So just like as we did for the tile set, let's create a texture slot to bake our normal maps into. So I'm just gonna, in this graph editor, come and press Shift and A and add a new texture of type image texture. Okay, from here I'm just gonna press New, and let's call this, doesn't fully matter, but normal, and I'm going to give it a 4K size. Again, because you can always reduce the size of a texture fairly easily, but once it is baked at a smaller size, it's very hard to up-res it without creating pixelation and blurriness. So generated type, I'm going to change it from UV grid back to blank, and we can hit OK. I'm also going to change the color space from sRGB to raw. Again, if you forget and you bake it as an sRGB, you may get some errors here, but once you save it out, once you have the image, you should be able to change it back, and it should not cause any issues for you. Okay, so I have my texture ready to bake into, so I'm going to come down to my bake settings here, and we're going to change it from combined to normal, just as we did before. But instead of doing this selected to active here, there's this option here that says bake from multi-res. So let's enable that. Now it gets rid of a lot of our options here because it's just going to be looking at this one mesh to bake. So we're going to be on viewport level 0 here, but it's going to look at the highest level of subdivision we have and bake that information into the lowest. So let's just do a quick test render. I'm going to bring my max samples down to like 1 to speed this up, but for our final render, we will want to up-res this back again so we get really a smooth bake. But let's just see what happens here. I also don't need a margin size of 16. I can be something smaller. Okay, so let's go ahead and just hit bake. And make sure that in your preview window here, you have it actually set to the normal. So this is our normal result here. So let's go ahead and connect this to our material so we can visualize it on our mesh itself. We want vector, normal map, connect color to color, and normal to normal. All right, let's come into layout just to view this in isolation. So that actually looks pretty good. One thing I did notice is that these UVs maybe aren't the most optimally laid out. Typically, when you're unwrapping UV objects, you want to take up as much of this space as possible to get the maximum resolution here. So like if this is a 4K texture that we're applying to, well, almost half of that space is being wasted right here. So let's see if we can get these islands to be a little bit bigger, but still fit into this 0 to 1 space. So I think I'm going to add a seam. I'm going to add it. So I'm just analyzing how I have these seams right here. I'm actually going to select this one, and I want to get rid of this seam because I actually want to place it on this edge loop up here because this one goes all the way around. So let's clear this seam by just selecting it in the viewport, right-clicking while in edge select mode, and hitting clear seam, and that will remove any seams you have made. So I'm gonna move this seam 1 up by alt selecting this edge loop and marking it, and then I'm going to do this in the front so that I completely separate the top of the head from the rest of it. And I also think I want to connect these seams here, otherwise this one isn't doing much. So let's see how that looks. Now, when you unwrap after you've already baked a texture, you will see that this gets sort of messed up because it is still trying to map the texture that we have here, which is this one. And you can see the UVs are completely off from where they are supposed to be now because we have changed them. So keep in mind that if you go and change your UVs, you will have to rebake or repaint your textures depending on how far into this process you are. So it is always a good idea to make sure that your UVs are really solid before you move on. Otherwise, you will end up having to redo some work. It's not too bad though. I'm gonna X out this normal so it's not in my way. And what I'm going to do is I'm gonna try to lay these out so that I'm using more of this space. So each of these individual areas is called a UV island when they're entirely separated from each other. If we come up right here and select this icon, this is island select. So now when I go and I click, I will be selecting on a per island basis. So I'm gonna try to lay these out in a way that is using more of this 0 to 1 space. So what I'm gonna do is I'm first just gonna select these and just move them aside. And then I'm gonna select this one, and I'm just gonna rotate it sort of at a diagonal because it can use more space that way. So now what I'm going to do is I want to scale this one up. However, I don't want to lose the relative uniformity I have between the scales of these islands, right? Remember, when we were creating seams, we were trying to make sure that all of these checkers stayed uniform, and we still want that. So if I were to scale one of these islands right now, you can see that it's not going to maintain that uniformity. So what I'm going to do is select everything and I'm just going to scale it up. And I'm just trying to eyeball basically when this strip here is using the maximum amount of space, but still staying within this border. Rotation you can do totally independently. It's really just the scale that you need to worry about. And of course you can lay these out any way you want. The rotation of your UV islands will not affect how it appears on your texture unless you are using a texture you've already created. So we're going to be hand painting this, so we don't need to worry too much about things being rotated in ways that aren't reflective of the final model. So that is a little bit better use of UV space. It's not, you know, obviously there's still some wasted space here, but for our purposes that is sufficient. Okay, so let's do this bake again. I'm going to switch back to my material here. And I like to, you don't need to be in the shading tab to bake. I just like to be here because it shows me all the pertinent information that I have. So another thing to note is that if I were to bake this right now, okay, so sometimes when you bake, you'll get an error message here if your image is connected. I don't think this applies for using a multi-res, but if you ever get a error down here that says something about a circular dependency, just go ahead and disconnect this, select it, and hit bake again, and you should have no problem there. And actually, it doesn't look like this seam is doing a lot for me, so there's really no reason to have it. So I'm just going to clear these. You can leave them. They're not affecting this in any negative way. It just looks a little messy. Okay, let's look at this one more time. Okay, so okay, this is a decent layout. The other thing you want to keep in mind when laying out your UVs is that you want some space in between your islands here, because typically when you're baking and creating textures, there will be a few pixels of bleed over between your islands and whatever is next to it. So if you have your islands like really close right here like this, and I were to start baking or texture painting, there's a possibility that some of the texture from this island would bleed over onto this island, and you would see that on your model. So make sure that each island gets a little bit of padding. How much padding they need is really up to you and how much space you have. This is plenty of padding. It probably doesn't need this much, but I have the space, so I'm going to use it. Okay, let's do this one more time. Okay, so that's a much cleaner result. We don't have that weird gap in our ear here. So what I would do from here is I would up-res my samples back up and bake a full resolution version of this, but that's going to take a couple more minutes. So I'm just going to hit bake and probably pause the recording. Okay, so my normal bake has completed at full resolution here. You can see that I just have a much better quality here on that surface detail especially. So I'm going to connect this to this, and that is our normal map. We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we are going to be baking the ambient occlusion map for this piece.